The sun was setting, painting the Sacramento sky in warm shades of gold and amber. Eric Porter drove home after a long day at the office, his mind tired but relieved at the thought of the peaceful evening ahead. The radio played softly, mixed with the low hum of the engine as he adjusted the air conditioning. He approached the intersection and slowed down when the yellow light came on. For a fleeting moment, he was confident that he had slowed down in time. But just as his wheels slid across the line, the flashing red and blue lights behind him suddenly burst into life, accompanied by a sharp siren. His heart sank. A familiar but disturbing feeling crept into his mind. He glanced in the rearview mirror and exhaled slowly, stopping the car on the side of the road. The window rolled down as the patrol car pulled up behind him. Officer Bradley Larson stepped out of the car with the confident air of someone accustomed to being in control. In his early 30s, his face was cold but sharp. The shiny badge on his chest reflected the late afternoon light. Larson adjusted his belt and stepped closer to Eric's car. "License and registration," Larson said, his voice low but authoritative. Eric didn't object, just nodded slightly and reached into the glove compartment. He did everything slowly, deliberately letting Larson see his every move. The caution wasn't out of fear, but because he knew that police were wary of even the smallest movements. Larson took the papers, not taking his eyes off Eric. His gaze was sharp, as if searching for some sign, a reason to be suspicious, to dig deeper. "Do you know why I asked you to stop?" Larson asked, his voice not exactly harsh, but not sympathetic either. Eric kept his cool, his gaze steady but not challenging. "I'm not sure." "You didn't stop at the red light," Larson said, but there was a hesitation in his tone. He seemed to realize that Eric's mistake wasn't that serious. Eric frowned, but then nodded slowly. "I understand. I think I slowed down in time, but if you feel otherwise, I respect that." A moment of silence passed between them. Larson looked at Eric for a long moment, as if considering something. But instead of issuing a reprimand, a ticket, or a lecture on traffic laws, he simply handed over his license. "Be more careful next time," Larson said, and his voice, for the first time during the conversation, softened slightly. Eric took his papers, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, officer. I'll remember." Larson nodded, walking back to his car. As Eric drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Larson's image was still there, standing in the evening light, a part of Sacramento, a part of the city Eric was so familiar with, but at the same time never really understood. Larson didn't answer right away. Instead, he lingered, his sharp gaze studying Eric longer than necessary. It wasn't a simple traffic stop anymore, at least, not to Larson. His posture shifted subtly but clearly, as if a decision had been made. A minor infraction? No. This was something else, something bigger. The officer glanced at the license in his hand, his fingers tightening a little. "You're not from around here, are you?" Larson's voice rose, a hint of doubt mixed with an unfathomable sharpness. Eric hesitated for a moment. The brief moment was enough to make the air around them heavier. "I moved here a few months ago," he answered, his voice calm. "My address is on the license." But Larson wasn't really listening. He didn't care about the address on the piece of paper. His questions became sharper, with a hidden pressure. It was no longer a simple examination, but an informal interrogation. Eric could feel the atmosphere change. His calm demeanor didn't seem to please Larson. The officer leaned forward, his shadow looming over Eric, an invisible weight. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" Larson asked, his tone sounding as if the answer was more important than anything else. Eric kept his cool. "Just going home." His answer was simple, but it did nothing to ease the tension that was simmering between them. Larson no longer considered him a reckless driver. His eyes scanned Eric as if peeling back layers, searching for something deeper, something he believed existed. Eric recognized the doubt in the other's eyes. Tension crept through his breathing, but he didn't flinch. Calmness wasn't innocence, it was control. Larson straightened slowly, as if savoring the moment. He folded Eric's license with a suspiciously deliberate air, slipping it into his breast pocket with an unnatural slowness. Then he spoke, cold and clear. "Step out of the car for me." Eric squeezed the steering wheel lightly, an unconscious gesture that didn't shake. His face remained impassive, every line holding its composure. "Is there a specific reason, officer?" he asked, his voice devoid of fear. Larson paused for a second, his lips twitching, as if surprised by Eric's reaction. But he quickly regained his composure. "I asked you to step out of the car." Larson's voice dropped, carrying an unspoken warning. "You don't want to make this any harder than it has to be." The air thickened. An unspoken threat hung between them. Eric exhaled slowly and opened the door. As he stepped out, Larson's eyes swept over him, not just assessing, but searching for something. A sign. An opening. But all he saw was a man of suspiciously perfect proportions. Eric stood a little taller than the officer. His shoulders were broad, but there was no threat in his stance. His suit was tailored, unwrinkled, his shoes gleamed as if they had never entered anything less than perfection. A man of precision, of discipline, or perhaps of calculation. But there was something else. Something Larson couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. "Hands where I can see them." Eric followed, not slow but not hurried. Every movement was deliberate, as if he had a purpose. It made Larson uncomfortable. "Is there anything specific you're looking for?" Larson smiled weakly. It wasn't genuine. Just the usual. "We've had a few incidents here. You can never be too careful." Eric tilted his head, his eyes glinting with something, not doubt, not challenge, but an understanding so deep it was frightening. "Incidents involving men in business suits, driving cars." His tone didn't change, but there was a weight to each word. "Or is it more about something else?" The question hit like an invisible punch. For a moment, just a moment, but enough to break Larson's composure. His fingers tightened around his belt, not out of necessity, but out of reflex. A reflex triggered by a feeling he couldn't quite place. "Watch your tone." Larson's voice hardened. "I'm just asking a question," Eric replied, still calm, but there was an unshakable determination in his voice. A determination that unsettled Larson. Larson stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You seem very familiar with how this works. Is there something you're hiding?" The silence stretched a beat longer. The air thickened, not with tension, but with something deeper, a mental game that only one player played. "No, officer." Eric's tone remained the same. "I just believe in clarifying the reason for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know." Larson smirked, but didn't reply. He backed away, circling the car. But the dynamic was changing. Not in the way he wanted it to. Eric didn't react the way most people would. There was no fear. No stuttering. No nervousness. Just control. An unsettling calm. A silence that spoke louder than words. That made Larson tense. "You seem pretty confident." Larson muttered, almost to himself. His voice was low, tinged with a vague annoyance. "Like you think you know what's coming next." Eric didn't take the bait. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes calm but piercing. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Larson froze for a second, a brief moment, but enough to see his wavering. His eyes narrowed, the faint smoky glint in his gaze gone, replaced by a different tone, sharper, more defensive. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Eric's calmness threw him off balance, and he didn't like it. The silence stretched, thick as if it could cut through. The tension between them was electric, a silent but powerful battle. And Larson was beginning to realize that things were going in a different direction than he had expected. But instead of backing down, he clenched his jaw, deciding to double down on the challenge. Larson tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt, an unconscious but equally threatening gesture. His frustration was almost palpable in every line of his face. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone like Eric. His eyes flicked back to the car, as if searching for a valid reason, one he couldn't yet come up with. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," Larson said, his voice hardening. "I need to check for weapons." Eric raised his eyebrows, his eyes scanning the officer's face. "Weapons?" he repeated, his tone not exactly mocking, but somehow disbelieving. "Do I look like a man with a weapon?" The tension in Larson's jaw was palpable. For a moment, his placid facade cracked. "I won't ask again." Eric hesitated. Something flickered in his eyes, unreadable, then he exhaled softly, said nothing, simply turned and placed his palm on the hood of the car. An act of compliance, but not submission. Larson stepped forward, his boots crunching on the asphalt, breaking the heavy silence. He patted Eric briefly, but his gesture was more than a casual inspection, it was stiff, more rough than necessary. The hand lingered a moment longer, as if searching for something, or perhaps simply a way to assert power. But Eric didn't react. No stiffness. No wavering. No sign of discomfort. The calmness was almost a blow to Larson, making his discomfort grow. Finally, the officer withdrew his hand, straightened, and stared at him. "You're clean," Larson muttered, but his voice was no longer as firm as before. Eric turned to face him, his expression still calm, but his eyes sharp. "Of course I am," he said simply. "Now, officer, if you're done." "I'm not done." Larson interrupted, his voice rising unnaturally. The words came out too quickly, betraying his attempt to maintain control. An undisguised irritation was bubbling up inside him. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do." Larson lowered his voice, but the edge remained. "Care to explain why?" Eric crossed his arms, his posture relaxed, despite the tension between them. "I've had quite a bit of experience with law enforcement," he replied, his voice even. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Larson's eyes narrowed. "So, are you a lawyer or something?" Eric merely smiled, a faint, almost indifferent smile. "Or something." The vagueness of the answer made Larson uncomfortable. He took a step forward, invading Eric's space, forcing him to feel the heat of his simmering anger. His voice dropped, almost to a growl. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Eric returned his gaze, unwavering. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And I haven't seen much of that here." The words hung in the air, a clear challenge. And Larson took the bait. "Fair? Is that what you think fairness is?" His voice cracked, then stopped abruptly. The words lingered in the air, like smoke that hadn't quite cleared. Eric's expression didn't change, but something in his demeanor shifted, a subtle but unmistakable sign that he had picked up on exactly what Larson was deliberately leaving unsaid. "People like me?" Eric repeated, his voice soft but full of meaning. Larson recoiled, as if realizing he had crossed a line. He muttered, his voice lacking the certainty he had had before. "You know what I mean." Eric tilted his head, regarding him with a disarming calm. "I think I do," he replied, his voice soft but no longer passive. Cutting through the veneer like a sharp blade. And we both knew, this conversation had become more than a simple traffic violation. Larson opened his mouth, about to say something. But the words stuck in his throat. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not quite sure how to handle the situation. The balance of power was shifting. And for the first time, the ground beneath Larson's feet seemed to shake. The moment of reckoning had not yet come. But when it did, he would never forget it. Eric's voice tore through the stifling silence. Certain. Unwavering. I think it's time you knew who I am. Larsen's brow furrowed, irritation flashing in his eyes. I don't care who you are, he shot back. But this time, his tone was less firm. Something was wobbly. Eric reached into his pocket. Slowly. Deliberately. Every movement was calculated. I'm just getting my badge. His voice was calm. His eyes never left Larsen, watching his hand twitch near the holster. No need to be dramatic. I just wanted you to see it. The words hung between them, heavy, hinting at something unspoken. Larsen's eyes followed Eric's movements. As he pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open. The light caught a shiny badge. Eric Porter. His tone was oddly calm. As if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. Chief Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. Larsen froze. His eyes lingered on the badge, then back to Eric's face. Searching for some sign that this was a joke. But there was no humor on the other's face. Only quiet authority and a hint of disappointment. Internal Affairs. Larsen repeated. His voice sounded like something was stuck in his throat. Yours. Eric interrupted, freeing him from his futile attempt to complete the thought. I monitor officer conduct. It is my job to ensure that those who wear this badge maintain the integrity and values it represents. Larsen's face was white. His usual confidence was crumbling. And he instinctively took a small step back. Eric's hand left his belt, as if the weight of his own authority had suddenly become too much. He took a step forward, closing the gap Larsen had instinctively created. Do you know what's most troubling about this? His voice was still calm, but each word was as sharp as a freshly sharpened knife. Officer Larsen didn't respond. His face was rigid, his eyes wide as if he'd just realized he'd stepped into a quagmire with no idea how to get out. It's not that you judged me, Eric continued, his eyes never leaving Larsen. Although that's bad enough. Nor is it the unwarranted escalation. It's the fact that you did all this, without even realizing who you were talking to. A pause. A heavy silence. You think I don't know my rights? Eric's voice dropped, each word falling like heavy stones. That I wouldn't understand the law you're sworn to uphold, and why it exists. Larsen opened his mouth, but no words came out. Eric's eyes stared at him, steady, unwavering. Because I don't fit your idea of a man worthy of respect, Eric said, finishing the sentence for Larsen. Not angrily. But the words carried the weight of an indictment. And it's not just my problem, officer. Larsen's shoulders slumped. It was as if the full weight of those words were pressing down on him, crushing every last ounce of resistance. His gaze slid back to the badge in Eric's hand, as if he didn't look too closely, it might disappear. Eric pulled back a little, giving Larsen room to breathe. But his voice never lost its edge. This is what happens, he said, his voice low and clear. You will take a step back, give me back my papers, and think carefully about what you say next. Larsen's lips moved, but he hesitated. A silent battle was raging in his eyes, between resistance and obedience. That hesitation was losing him. Eric leaned forward, his voice low, almost a warning. And you will hear from me again. Not as a driver pulled over. He paused, letting the words sink in. But as a man charged with deciding whether you are fit to wear that badge. Silence fell. Larsen's hand clenched, then slowly opened. Larsen swallowed, his throat dry. His face flushed as the weight of the moment pressed down on his chest. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out Eric's license and registration. His hand shook slightly as he handed them to Eric, a small sign of the nervousness he tried to hide. But Eric saw it. Eric took them without a word. Without checking them again, He stuffed them into his wallet, his movements slow but decisive. He walked toward the driver's side door of the car, pausing as he placed his hand on the handle. Then he turned, his sharp gaze locked on Larson. There was no anger, no contempt, just an unnerving calm. "Remember, Officer Larson," Eric's voice was low and clear. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." Larson didn't respond. Not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, his heart pounding in his chest. Eric slid into the car, starting the engine. For a brief moment, Larson just stood there, swallowed by the dusk. His confidence was shaken, the future before him dimmed. Uncertainty began to creep into every cell. But for Eric, things were far from over. The ripples he was about to create would shake the entire police department. The ride home was quiet, but Eric's mind was not. The scene played over and over in his head, not because it was special, but because it wasn't special. Larson wasn't the first officer Eric had faced. And he knew he wouldn't be the last. But this time it was different. This time, Eric had the authority to act. The next morning, Eric sat down at his desk. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of his Sacramento Police Department office, Internal Affairs. Before him was an open file folder. Officer Bradley Larson. His file wasn't exactly clean. Minor complaints of unprofessional conduct, suspicious stops, vague misunderstandings, all ignored, never properly addressed. A familiar pattern. One Eric had seen too many times. He leaned back in his chair, fingers curled in front of him. The silence in the room was heavy. Larson wasn't an isolated incident. He was a symptom of a much deeper problem. And Eric wasn't interested in slapping a band-aid on a gunshot wound. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Eric took a deep breath, preparing for his next move. This wasn't personal anymore. This was a larger battle, and he wasn't backing down. Linda entered the office, a heavy stack of reports in her hands. She adjusted the file as she spoke softly but professionally. "Good morning, Mr. Porter. I've compiled the report on last month's incidents." She paused before adding, "Chief Daniels also wanted me to remind you about next week's department review." Eric nodded, taking the file from her. "Thank you, Linda. You can also schedule a meeting with Chief Daniels this afternoon. There's something I need to discuss with him." Linda hesitated for a moment. She sensed something in Eric's tone, it wasn't just administrative. She glanced into his eyes, seeing a subtle tension. "Of course," she replied, her voice softening slightly, as if to show concern, before quietly leaving the room. As the door closed, Eric turned back to Larson's file, but his mind was not on the individual officer. This was not about a single person or a single situation. It was about a culture, a system that allowed misconduct to persist. And if there was one thing Eric knew, it was that culture was always shaped from the top. That afternoon, Eric sat across from Chief Daniels in the conference room. The older man with the salt and pepper hair and stern expression leaned back in his chair, listening intently as Eric recounted the traffic stop. "I could have written it off as just another unfortunate incident, another negative interaction," Eric said, his voice firm but determined. "But that would have been a mistake. Larson's behavior was not an isolated incident. It was a true reflection of how much work we have to do." Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the first time Larson's name has come up in reports," he admitted. "But we've always dealt with it quietly, internally." "And that's the problem," Eric replied immediately. "Silence doesn't solve anything. On the contrary, it allows this to continue. It's time for us to speak up." Daniels looked at him, his eyes heavy with thought. "So what do you propose?" "A review of the entire department," Eric answered without hesitation. "Not just of individuals, but of our training systems, our protocols, and how we enforce them. We can't just fix a small part of the problem. We need to change the whole foundation. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Daniels took a deep breath, looked down at the conference table, before looking up with a slow nod. We'll do it your way. But make sure you're ready, because this isn't going to be an easy fight. Eric clenched his fists on the table, his gaze determined. I never expected it to be easy. We can't keep hiding this forever. Daniels leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. His voice was low but heavy. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us? Eric looked at him, unflinching. Yes. There will be those who are not happy. But it's time for someone to do this. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, intense interviews, and endless, exhaustive reporting. Eric threw himself into the work with relentless tenacity, collecting data, talking to officers, listening to the community in public forums. Each story, each testimony only strengthened his resolve. Larson's case was more than an incident. It was a turning point. A catalyst that forced the entire system to confront its own flaws. Larson, for his part, faced an internal hearing. Eric did not shy away from his involvement. He sat there, across from Larson, watching the officer fumble through the questions, piece by piece, under the watchful eye of the judge. In the end, the verdict was in suspension. But Eric knew the real victory was not punishing Larson. It was preventing another Larson from ever happening. Months later, Eric stood at the podium at a community event, surrounded by officers, city officials, and local residents. He was not talking about blame. He was talking about accountability. About the shared obligation of everyone in the room, to build a system that is fair, transparent, and trustworthy. Justice is not just about catching bad guys, his voice echoed through the hall. It's about ensuring that those who have sworn to protect and serve carry out that duty with integrity, fairness, and respect. He paused for a second, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. Some were skeptical. Some were hopeful. This is the badge I believe in. And it's the badge we're building together. The applause was thunderous. But Eric didn't linger on the moment of victory. For him, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something better. But it will come. And for now, that's enough. This time, everyone is listening. If this story resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Start the conversations that matter. The ones that lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Stories that challenge us. Inspire us. And remind us of what we're capable of. When we stand up for what's right.